Is there another way of learning Portuguese? Please tell me there is. Usually people come to me wanting an alternative way of learning Portuguese. They're out of their wits with tried anything from apps, from different courses, one-on-one, group courses, in person, online, and not that nothing works, but they still cannot express themselves. So they come to me because obviously seeing Unschool gives an idea of something alternative. Now, that's exactly what I offer, an alternative way of learning Portuguese. And essentially what we're going to do today is I'm going to share with you some tips of alternative ways you could be learning Portuguese, which will be not only more efficient, but more fun, okay? So are you still learning European Portuguese the traditional way in 2023? I hope not. In case you don't know me, I'm Katerina. I've learned 10 foreign languages myself, which does not mean by any means I speak them all fluently. Some, it's actually more passive knowledge. What I've gone through really through that journey was something that happened throughout the years. Learning them the traditional way, I loved it because that's like my hobby, that's my thing, learning languages. But then at some point it got too much, like I couldn't handle the traditional way anymore. And I think no one could handle me in a classroom because I was always the annoying student saying, oh, but is that like in Polish, but the opposite of whatever? And everyone would look at me like, are you nuts? And I'm like, yes, with languages I am. So I've combined everything that helps you learn the language in an organic and holistic way, because language is very much part of who we are, how we express ourselves, and it's very strange and comfortable and limiting when you cannot say what you want, when maybe you're a really funny person in English or in French, but you come to Portugal and it just doesn't work. Even when you get to the point where you can speak the language, how to express your sense of humor, because maybe your sense of humor will not be norm in Portuguese. So it's really unraveling who you are in Portugal in Portuguese. So it's a journey and it can be fun, and I'll show you how. Okay, I always like to start looking at a new language by seeing with a macro vision of the language. So how is it different? How is it similar to your native language or possibly other languages you know? Because I think it prepares you for when you come to the language. So to give you a practical example, when I started learning Mandarin, I was very curious. My motivation was not, I'm moving to China or something like you might have with Portuguese, but I was curious, why is it considered one of the hardest languages in the world? Now I know Chinese is actually pretty simple in certain ways, like any language will be, but the gateway, the entrance to the language is very hard. It's very foreign for someone who only knows Western languages. I look at it and I don't know what I'm looking at. I have no clue how to read a menu, how to read a street sign. And that is something you should value about Portuguese, that it will have areas where it's tricky, but at least you can read it, okay? And you know how to read in your own language. So knowing how to read, now I see when I talk to my unschoolers, I say, look, you can read and you have a tool ready for you. It's you already crossed that boundary that you can read what's there in Portuguese. Doesn't mean you will pronounce it well in your head, but reading is a great way to build your vocabulary. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take a step back. Okay, so in a nutshell, what is different in Portuguese? Obviously, I cannot answer this here because I don't know what your native language is, but assuming you understand what I'm saying, you will know at least English. So generally speaking, you're talking about gender might be a problem for you. So knowing that in Portuguese we have feminine and masculine. So nouns have a gender. So a tree, for example, is feminine in Portuguese. So we start looking at a tree and anything related to a tree will be feminine. We see it as a female entity, okay? And knowing that affects everything. Like gender is everywhere. It's almost as if if you were dressing up a baby boy or a baby girl in Portugal or in Portuguese, it would have to be either full blue or full pink. There's no green or yellow. That's not possible in the language. The language is still very old-fashioned in that way, sexist, if you will. So that's one thing. The other is the use of the definite article. So the in English, which in Portuguese we have o for masculine nouns, for feminine nouns, and then we have os, es if we're talking about something plural. Now, that will have an impact also in if you're being formal towards someone and you know the person's first name when you're talking towards that person. So if you know me and we're not in very formal towards each other, but you might say, a Catarina gosta de Coca-Cola. Okay, instead of, which in English would be, the Catarina likes Coca-Cola, which sounds really weird, but that's how we would say it. We also use a definite article before possessive pronouns. So if you're saying my cat is blue, no, my cat couldn't be blue. My cat is black, we would say o meu gato é preto. Right? We need the my cat is black. I always use a car example, that's why I'm getting confused here. And the car would be blue. Anyway, bear with me. The thing which I sort of already touched upon is formality. So generally speaking, this is a formal culture. So you need to understand the implications that has in the use of the language. So which verb, if you look at a verb table, you're going to be using the third person singular to address someone. When can you be informal? Then all kinds of words. If you say I'm sorry in Portuguese, you need to know, are you being formal or informal? It's important. My general advice is be formal, depending on your age, but let's say if you're like in your 20s, maybe talking to someone your age, then informal is fine. 30s perhaps as well, but from then on, let's say if you're retired in Portugal, and if that didn't happen early, then you would be safer to be formal, maybe towards a child informal, but it's something that it can take some time to get your head around. Now, moving on to another thing that's super important with European Portuguese. So if you've spoken to as many people as I have, asking them what is your main struggle with this language, you would know that it's pronunciation, as in understanding what people say. So that's tied to pronunciation. So not how you pronounce words, but how you hear them. And basically I have a video about that explains the whole logic around it. So nothing in Portugal, if I may dare say so, is logical or practical except for how we pronounce things. And I know that it sounds like one long word and that we swallow everything, but there's logic to it. So a very short summary here is letters either change according to who they're next to. The ones to watch out for are the M, N, S, and Z. Okay, sometimes the S will sound like S, sometimes it will sound like a Z, sometimes it will sound like a Sh. So you need to watch out where they are. Just like people change according to who they're next to. Now I'm talking to a camera, and I will be different when I'm talking to a real person. Although I am imagining I'm talking to you. Okay. The other thing that happens is letters vanish. I say vanish, not entirely true, but it's just one way of expressing a concept. So the E, and by letters I mean the vowels, so the E and the O at the end of words will go like whoop. The O becomes more of a oo, but very soft oo. And then you have the I or the U can disappear in the middle of words, but that can be original. It depends. We're missing the A. The A is one that will not disappear, except there's something happened in the, last few years or so, that instead of saying teja, we say teja, because no other word will sound like teja. So it's a fixed phrase actually, so we know what the person is saying. But if you see this, you've always seen it in a textbook or so, teja, and you expect to hear an A sound, an a or a, at best, forget it. It's going to be disappointment, that's for sure. The last thing that happens in terms of phonetics of Portuguese is that letters, not only letters, but words get married, okay? So they stick together. If let's say you divorce one and then you lose one along the way, so you just stick to the following word, it's more practical, believe me. And when you understand when that happens, it's a whole nother game and things start making sense. That doesn't mean that that's it. Like if you watch the video I mentioned, you're done. No, because it does require a lot of repetition, exposure, listening, of course, to the language. Understanding where the stress syllable in Portuguese is also key. I've spoken about the Queen of Portuguese a few times. That video, again, explains that concept. Something I recommend from day one is listen. And of course, in the beginning, if you have no clue what Portuguese is like, the intention is not that, oh, you should understand what people are saying in the song or whatever content you're listening to. No, it's just getting your ears familiar with the language, because when you step into learning vocabulary or grammar or anything, it's going to make it much harder if the language sounds foreign to you, okay? For example, when I started learning German, for me, I associated German with Second World War documentaries or films. So for me, it sounded aggressive and Heinz, this is how it sounded to me, which is ridiculous if I think now in hindsight. But the moment I started learning, my husband started playing German music, contemporary German music at home. And then I was like, oh, the German language is actually normal. They talk about daily lives and there's actually tune to it and I like it. Huh, silly me. So from then on, it was much easier. I was much more receptive to the language. So the listening, obviously you're going to do tons of it, I hope. That's particularly needed with European Portuguese. But then when you cannot hear and understand what you're hearing if you don't know any grammatical structures or have any vocabulary. So to do those things, reading is a perfect combination of doing that, right? So let's say you would start with a children's book, and I know not everyone will like it, but if you live in Portugal, certainly you have access to a library. Go there, check where the children's section is, look on the low shelves, or ask someone if they don't speak Portuguese. Even better, like just gesticulate and they understand you don't speak Portuguese and they will try to help. Now, I don't suggest one of those picture books that say this with a duck and saying duck, pato, but actually some that will have already big fonts, short sentences, sort of question, and then the answer, okay? Onde é que está o bolinha? O bolinha está ali, whatever. And then the good thing about children's books that I think a lot of people miss out on is repetition. Most books will have, I don't know, they will rhyme or they will focus on one question word, and you get this repetition over and over again, the same question word, the same vocabulary. And it's amazing because it gets into your brain without you even almost noticing. Now, if you can find books, whether children's books or something a bit more advanced that has audio next to it to play alongside, then that's a great thing to do, because you start, if you already dabble into how we pronounce things, and then you get content that you can read and listen at the same time, it's amazing, because then you start hearing and hopefully you will know how to recognize the patterns of how we pronounce things. Because if you read a piece of text by yourself in your head, it will certainly sound different than what you're listening to. Just watch out for finding content that will be too, I like to call it news Portuguese. That's great, but it's not how people in their daily lives will speak, okay? That's very formal Portuguese. Things will be enunciated. Words will not be married as much as they are if another person is speaking. So one way to find that kind of content is checking my Mini-Tuga below. So I have a link in the description. If you haven't grabbed it, have a look, because it has several pieces of native content that you can use to read and listen at the same time. Another thing that would be great for you to do to expose yourself to Portuguese is finding low entertainment in Portuguese. So soap operas are a good example. I also talked about it in this video. And I know some people will not like it, again, as children's books, but I do suggest you give it a try, because you will be exposed to expressions which are harder to translate and can be overwhelming in the beginning. But don't forget that if you want to be able to converse with people in your day-to-day life in Portugal, you need to have that exposure. And it's much easier if you have this preparation online from the comfort of your home, where you can pause, rewind, check a word, check an expression, and then come back to it. So if you find a soap opera that has subtitles, and I have a great one in the Mini-Tuga as well, but there's more. You can see, for example, a dialogue where people are going to ask questions and answers. Now, I've spoken about how empowering it is to know how to ask questions in this video. And it's something you can get practical exposure when watching a soap opera. And you need to be patient with yourself in the beginning. We're used to wanting to know everything we're hearing, understand it, but that will not happen from day one, okay? So you need to be patient with yourself and keep trying. Of course, don't dwell too much on the use of subtitles because you're practicing two different skills there. You're listening and you're reading at the same time. So if you want to then at some point focus on just the listening and turn off the subtitles and really just focus on working on exercising your ears, okay? One great thing about YouTube is that you can find tons of content in European Portuguese. Just watch out that it's not Brazilian, and something you're interested in, or even not, like try to find an interview, something of the sort where people are just casually speaking, and then clip the video, okay? You can clip as short as you want, cannot be as long as you want, but what's the point? The point is that it's short, and then try to mimic what people say. Start with body language. You may have noticed, I mean, I do try not to, but in Portugal, people speak a lot with their hands. They go do like this and da-da-da. I can maybe one day do more of hand gestures, and I try not to because otherwise it gets too much for you. But it's not like Italian where doing this has a meaning, doing that has another meaning. In Portuguese, there isn't a specific meaning associated. We just talk like this. So if you would add hand gestures to your Portuguese, that will help somehow. The other thing is then, you may notice, I don't know, lifting the eyebrows. I think it's something we do a lot. I'm starting to notice. I mean, I know I do it, but I think generally speaking, people do. I don't know if you've noticed that. And then you can go into try to mimic the intonation, check the musicality of the language, even the tone of voice. Like, for example, Dutch is a very low language. I know that when I speak Dutch, my voice will sound lower, more manly. And what is your impression of Portuguese? How does it sound to you? Can you replicate it? Okay. Now, you cannot really avoid grammar when learning a language. I mean, some people do, and if you want to speak what I call Jane and Tarzan Portuguese, go ahead. But it will sound funny to us. Not that is sort of like our problem, but I mean, it can cause problems at some point that people don't understand what you're saying because you're using the wrong tense, and like you're speaking about the present or the future or the past, I don't know. So if you write sentences regularly, and if you have a native speaker that can correct them, it's a great way to organically understand how the language works. Now, last but not least, I think great advice is to track your progress. So have some sort of Excel sheet or anything that would work for you these days. There are tons of apps where you track how many minutes you spend on each skill per day, per week. And then that will show you that you've progressed in a certain area because you put in the work, or that you didn't, or that now you need to work on your speaking because you've been focusing too much on the listening, that the speaking got a bit neglected, let's say. So that gives you a clear picture of what's going on. Prati is one of my unschoolers who, after 2 years, is fluent. She never set foot in Portugal, not yet. And in this video, we had a conversation, more than 40 minutes, where she tells a bit about her journey, and the tracking of her progress was part of it. This is something I do on a weekly basis with my unschoolers, so it gives focus also to your Portuguese. So instead of thinking, oh, I have 1 year or I'm doing a 6-month course, no, you think on a weekly basis, what is it that I want to focus on? What is it that I need to focus on? Okay. Now, some people will be very independent about this. Some people need accountability. So working with a teacher or so, definitely, or having a group definitely helps. I think the traditional way of learning a language is outdated. You don't have to put yourself through all that rote memorization. our brains don't work like that. I mean, we used to that from school years, right? Learning languages or whatever it is that we had to memorize. I mean, my parents, when they were little at school in Portuguese, they had to learn names of train stations and railways and rivers in Portugal. Now they have that knowledge, but I mean, these days you Google and after a few seconds you know the answer. So what's the value in that? I mean, we know better now, and there is a more natural way of learning a language. Not exactly like a child would, but focusing on that, taking that as an example, that they listen first and they learn things in context. They just take a long time to speak and to process anything because they cannot speak when they're born. They cannot read and write by the time they're born either. So we have those at our fingertips, and we know, in theory, how to learn something. Okay, because as adults, it's now quite common that people have learned, done an online course, I've done some sort of learned a skill as an adult, and then you know, oh, I learned this. First of all, I want to learn it. So motivation is there. Second of all, I know how to learn it. I know the times of the day that I'm more active. I know that working in a group doesn't work for me. I know that I need some other people for accountability. So I wanted to make this video just to let you know there is hope. There is an alternative way of learning Portuguese. So whichever way you're learning Portuguese this year, I hope you make progress and that you see a difference and that you can quite soon enough at least understand the Portuguese and at some point be understood as well. Okay, I'll see you next week. Adeus.